On May 12, 1944, at 9:47 hours, an Allied reconnaissance aircraft flying at 27,000 feet over northern Germany exposed a sequence of photographs that did not match any known category of military installation. The images showed a concrete structure exceeding 150 meters in length, aligned with geometric precision toward open terrain, flanked by high earthen embankments and connected to a single rail spur terminating directly at its base. No aircraft dispersals were visible. No storage tanks. No conventional defensive layout. Subsequent frames revealed heat discoloration on the concrete surface, disturbed soil extending beyond the structure's axis, and a pattern of scorch marks absent in photographs taken 3 weeks earlier. In the surrounding area, forest clearings appeared freshly expanded. Temporary buildings were present in one image and absent in the next. Anti-aircraft positions were arranged to protect the structure rather than the region. During the same sortie, the pilot reported a brief visual contact with an aircraft approaching from above and behind at a speed exceeding known fighter capabilities. The contact lasted less than 4 seconds. No engagement followed. By the end of the day, analysts noted that the structure had no equivalent in existing intelligence files. Its function was unlisted. Its orientation unexplained. Its activity undocumented. Additional sorties were ordered. The next photographs would not simplify the picture. The reconnaissance group was formed within the established structure of Allied tactical and strategic air forces during the middle phase of the Second World War, when the need for accurate, timely aerial intelligence had become decisive for planning ground operations and strategic bombing. The unit consisted of experienced pilots who had already completed multiple operational sorties and had been selected for their ability to navigate independently, maintain discipline under fire, and accurately observe and record enemy activity. Their aircraft were modified for reconnaissance duties, with bomb racks removed, additional fuel tanks installed, and high-resolution cameras fitted into the fuselage. Armament was reduced to the minimum necessary for self-defense in order to increase range and altitude performance. By the spring of 1944, the operational environment over occupied Europe had changed markedly. German air defenses had been reorganized following earlier Allied bombing campaigns, radar coverage had been expanded, and new aircraft types were being introduced in limited numbers. Reconnaissance flights were tasked not only with photographing rail lines, airfields, and industrial facilities, but also with identifying unusual construction sites, changes in defensive layouts, and any signs of new technology that might affect Allied operations. Intelligence summaries from this period emphasized the importance of visual confirmation, as intercepted communications and prisoner interrogations often lagged behind actual developments. The group operated from a forward airfield in southern England that supported long-range sorties across the Channel and deep into the European mainland. Missions were planned by combining meteorological data, expected enemy fighter activity, and known flak concentrations. The pilots were briefed using maps annotated with previous reconnaissance results, indicating areas of particular interest. Camera settings, flight altitudes, and routes were determined in advance, but individual pilots retained discretion to deviate if circumstances required. On the day of the mission that would later be identified as significant, weather conditions over the Channel were marginal but acceptable. Cloud cover was broken at high altitude, with lower layers scattered enough to permit visual navigation. The reconnaissance group was assigned to survey a coastal region of northern Germany that had previously been photographed only intermittently due to heavy defenses. Recent intelligence reports had noted increased construction activity inland from the coast, including elongated structures and rail spurs leading to heavily guarded compounds. The aircraft departed individually at staggered intervals to reduce the likelihood of detection. Each pilot followed a prearranged route, climbing to operational altitude over friendly territory before crossing the coast. Radio silence was maintained, as was standard for reconnaissance missions. Navigation relied on dead reckoning, visual landmarks, and, where available, radio beacons. As the aircraft crossed into enemy airspace, the first indications of heightened alert became evident. Anti-aircraft fire was observed at greater distances than previously recorded, suggesting improvements in radar-directed flak. The pilots adjusted altitude and course slightly to remain within the limits of their briefing while avoiding the most intense concentrations. Upon reaching the designated area, the pilots began systematic photographic runs. Cameras operated automatically, exposing film at predetermined intervals. The landscape below showed signs of recent alteration. Forest clearings had been expanded, and concrete foundations were visible in patterns not consistent with known factories or airfields. In several locations, long, narrow structures were aligned along fixed axes, with earthen embankments on either side. One pilot recorded the presence of rail cars positioned adjacent to these structures, some of which appeared to be fitted with cranes. Security measures were evident, including dispersed anti-aircraft guns and perimeter fencing. The configuration differed from conventional ammunition depots or fuel storage facilities previously documented in the region. During the return leg of the photographic run, one aircraft encountered an unexpected aerial contact. At a higher altitude and approaching from the rear quarter, a fast-moving aircraft was observed, its speed exceeding that of known piston-engine fighters. The contact passed through the field of view rapidly and did not engage. The reconnaissance pilot noted the encounter in the post-flight report, describing the aircraft's straight wings, lack of propeller blur, and exhaust characteristics. Similar observations had been reported sporadically since late 1943 but had not yet been fully correlated. Anti-aircraft fire intensified as the reconnaissance aircraft turned toward their exit routes. Several bursts detonated closer than usual, indicating improved fire control. One aircraft sustained minor damage to the fuselage but remained airworthy. The pilots maintained course and altitude, relying on speed and height rather than evasive maneuvers that could compromise photographic coverage. After crossing back over the coast and returning to base, the aircraft landed without further incident. Ground crews immediately secured the exposed film canisters, which were transported under guard to the intelligence processing section. The pilots completed written debriefs detailing flight conditions, enemy activity, and any observations not captured on film. Photo interpreters began analysis within hours. Enlarged prints revealed details that had not been apparent during flight. The elongated structures measured approximately the same length across multiple sites and were often oriented toward open terrain or the sea. In some images, scorch marks and disturbed earth suggested recent high-temperature activity. Rail access appeared integral to the complexes, with sidings leading directly to reinforced buildings. Comparisons with earlier photographs showed rapid progress in construction over a short period, indicating high priority. Analysts cross-referenced these findings with reports from other reconnaissance units and with intelligence from resistance sources. The pattern began to resemble preliminary data associated with German long-range weapons programs, which had been the subject of speculation but limited confirmation. Further missions were authorized to expand coverage. The reconnaissance group was tasked with repeat flights to the same region and adjacent areas to establish continuity. Subsequent sorties confirmed that the sites were part of a broader network extending along the coast and inland. Some locations showed evidence of recent dismantling or camouflage, suggesting awareness of Allied surveillance. In parallel, reports of encounters with high-speed aircraft increased. Reconnaissance pilots from different units described similar characteristics, and the sightings were plotted against known Luftwaffe bases. This information was forwarded to Fighter Command and Technical Intelligence branches for assessment. By early summer 1944, the accumulated reconnaissance data contributed to a reassessment of German capabilities. The structures photographed were identified as launch and support facilities for experimental weapons, later confirmed through additional intelligence to be associated with guided missiles and pilotless aircraft. The aerial contacts were linked to jet-propelled fighters undergoing operational trials. The reconnaissance group continued operations under increasingly hazardous conditions. Enemy defenses adapted quickly, relocating equipment and altering patterns. Nevertheless, photographic coverage remained sufficient to support Allied planning. The information gathered influenced targeting priorities for subsequent bombing campaigns and informed defensive measures against potential deployment of the new weapons. Throughout this period, the reconnaissance pilots maintained routine operational procedures. Losses occurred within the broader reconnaissance force, though this particular group completed its assigned missions with limited casualties. Aircraft damage was frequent, and maintenance demands increased accordingly. The events documented during these missions were later incorporated into official operational histories and intelligence summaries. The photographs and reports provided contemporaneous evidence of technological developments that had previously been known only in outline. The reconnaissance group's role was recorded in unit diaries and after-action reports, forming part of the larger record of aerial intelligence operations during the war. This phase of operations marked a transition in the air war, as the introduction of new enemy technologies required adjustments in tactics and strategy. The reconnaissance missions described here contributed to that adaptation by providing factual, verifiable information under combat conditions. The work proceeded without public recognition at the time, consistent with the classified nature of the intelligence, but remained preserved in archival records used in post-war analysis. The narrative of these flights reflects the cumulative nature of reconnaissance work, in which individual observations gained significance only when assembled into a broader picture. The pilots' encounters with experimental weapons and aircraft were not isolated events but part of an evolving confrontation shaped by technological innovation and operational necessity. Following the initial identification of the unusual installations, reconnaissance priorities were adjusted to maintain sustained observation while minimizing losses. Flight paths were modified to approach the target regions from varying directions in order to complicate enemy tracking and prediction. Altitude profiles were altered between sorties, and timing was diversified to reduce the effectiveness of radar-directed defenses. These changes reflected established reconnaissance doctrine, which emphasized persistence combined with adaptability. The reconnaissance group's aircraft underwent incremental modifications during this period. Additional camera types were installed to capture oblique imagery, allowing analysts to assess vertical structures and internal layouts more effectively. Film stock was selected for higher contrast to improve detection of surface disturbances, exhaust residue, and structural reinforcement. Maintenance crews worked under tight schedules to ensure aircraft availability, often repairing flak damage overnight to meet operational demands. As sorties continued, photographic evidence accumulated showing repeated testing activity at several of the identified sites. Burn patterns on concrete aprons appeared and disappeared between flights, indicating regular launches or engine firings. Access roads showed heavy wear, and temporary buildings were erected and dismantled within short intervals. Rail traffic patterns fluctuated, with specialized cars arriving and departing on schedules inconsistent with routine logistics. These observations were documented systematically, with precise grid references and temporal annotations. Intelligence staffs correlated aerial photographs with signals intelligence that reported increased encrypted communications between coastal commands and research facilities deeper within Germany. Though the content of these communications could not be fully decrypted, traffic analysis suggested coordination beyond conventional air defense or coastal artillery roles. The reconnaissance imagery provided the spatial context needed to interpret these signals more effectively. Enemy countermeasures intensified as awareness of Allied surveillance grew. Camouflage techniques improved noticeably, including the use of netting, painted patterns, and decoy structures designed to resemble completed installations. Some sites were partially dismantled after being photographed, only to reappear weeks later in altered configurations. Reconnaissance pilots noted the increased frequency of flak barrages initiated before the aircraft reached the immediate vicinity of the targets, indicating predictive fire based on radar tracking. Encounters with high-speed enemy aircraft continued intermittently. Reports described brief visual contacts at altitudes above standard fighter operations, often without engagement. These aircraft were rarely observed maneuvering aggressively, suggesting their missions were experimental or ferry flights rather than interception. Technical intelligence units compiled these reports alongside recovered wreckage from other theaters, gradually assembling a clearer picture of jet propulsion development. During this phase, reconnaissance missions expanded inland to identify potential production and assembly facilities linked to the coastal sites. Photographs revealed large industrial complexes with enhanced security, often located near existing transportation hubs. Construction styles differed from traditional aircraft factories, with reinforced roofs and segmented layouts intended to reduce vulnerability to bombing. Analysts identified similarities between these facilities and known research establishments. The reconnaissance group operated under strict operational security. Mission details were compartmentalized, and pilots were briefed only on the immediate objectives relevant to their flights. Post-mission reports were handled through controlled channels, and dissemination of findings was limited to designated intelligence sections. This approach reflected the sensitivity of the information and the potential strategic impact of premature disclosure. As the Allied invasion of Western Europe approached, the tempo of reconnaissance increased further. The need to assess threats to ports, staging areas, and shipping lanes placed additional emphasis on identifying operational readiness of the experimental weapon sites. Reconnaissance flights documented signs of accelerated activity, including increased personnel presence, expanded power infrastructure, and test launches conducted at shorter intervals. Photographic evidence captured during this period showed several launch ramps aligned toward the Channel and southern England. Analysts measured angles and distances to estimate potential range and accuracy. These assessments were forwarded to air defense planners and civil defense authorities, informing preparations for possible attacks on population centers and military installations. Enemy responses included the relocation of some operations to underground facilities. Reconnaissance aircraft photographed tunnel entrances, ventilation shafts, and spoil heaps indicative of subterranean construction. Such features were often concealed within natural terrain or existing industrial zones. Oblique photography proved particularly valuable in identifying these elements, as vertical imagery alone was insufficient. Loss rates among reconnaissance units increased across the theater, though the group described here continued to complete missions through a combination of experience, planning, and favorable circumstances. Several aircraft returned with significant damage, and replacements were integrated as needed. Training of new pilots emphasized rapid familiarization with reconnaissance-specific procedures, including camera operation, navigation under radio silence, and emergency evasion techniques. The accumulation of reconnaissance data contributed directly to targeting decisions for strategic bombing. Air forces prioritized strikes against identified launch sites, production facilities, and transportation links. Post-strike reconnaissance was conducted to assess damage and determine the effectiveness of these operations. Photographs often showed partial destruction, necessitating repeated attacks to achieve lasting results. Despite bombing efforts, some experimental weapon activity continued. Reconnaissance imagery documented repairs and reconstruction undertaken with notable speed. This resilience underscored the importance placed on the programs by German command authorities. Intelligence assessments acknowledged that complete neutralization might not be achievable before operational deployment. As summer progressed, the first confirmed operational use of the experimental weapons occurred. Reconnaissance photographs captured launch aftermaths, including damaged structures and altered terrain consistent with recent firings. These images provided objective confirmation of intelligence reports from other sources and allowed analysts to refine estimates of production capacity and launch frequency. The reconnaissance group's role evolved accordingly. Missions shifted from discovery to monitoring, tracking operational patterns and identifying new sites as older ones were neutralized or abandoned. This required constant updating of target lists and flight plans. Coordination with other reconnaissance units increased to ensure comprehensive coverage. Throughout this period, the pilots adhered to established reporting standards, providing factual descriptions without speculation. Their observations, combined with photographic evidence, formed the basis of intelligence briefings at higher command levels. The clarity and consistency of these reports were essential for maintaining an accurate understanding of enemy capabilities. By late summer 1944, Allied ground advances in Western Europe altered the strategic context. Some previously photographed sites fell within range of advancing forces, allowing for ground confirmation of aerial intelligence. Reconnaissance units adjusted their focus toward areas beyond the immediate front, where retreating enemy forces might relocate sensitive equipment. Captured documents and facilities later corroborated many of the earlier aerial assessments. Measurements taken on the ground matched those derived from photographs, validating reconnaissance methods. Technical materials recovered from these sites confirmed the experimental nature of the weapons and the extent of resources devoted to their development. The reconnaissance group continued operations into this new phase of the campaign, applying the same procedures developed earlier. Their work remained largely unseen by the broader public at the time, but it constituted a continuous thread linking observation, analysis, and operational response. The events documented during this period were preserved in mission logs, photographic archives, and intelligence summaries that would later inform comprehensive histories of the air war. This sustained reconnaissance effort demonstrated the critical role of systematic observation in understanding and countering technological innovation during wartime. The encounters with experimental weapons and aircraft were integrated into the larger operational picture through disciplined reporting and analysis. The group's activities during this phase represented a continuation of established practice under changing conditions, contributing materially to Allied awareness and preparedness as the conflict progressed. As Allied forces consolidated their positions on the continent, reconnaissance requirements shifted again, reflecting the fluid nature of the operational environment. The rapid movement of front lines created both opportunities and challenges for aerial intelligence. Areas previously inaccessible due to range or defense density now fell within reach, while others became obscured by the pace of retreat and destruction carried out by German forces. The reconnaissance group adapted by extending sorties deeper into central Germany and adjacent occupied territories where relocated research, testing, and production activities were suspected. Aircraft operating procedures were updated to account for longer distances and reduced availability of emergency landing fields. Fuel management became increasingly critical, and mission planning incorporated contingency routes designed to exploit newly captured Allied airstrips if required. Reconnaissance pilots were briefed on evolving ground situations, including the presence of friendly anti-aircraft units whose identification signals differed from those used earlier in the campaign. Photographic targets during this period included rail junctions, industrial valleys, and remote regions previously considered peripheral. Intelligence analysis suggested that experimental weapons programs were being dispersed to reduce vulnerability. This dispersion resulted in smaller, less conspicuous installations that required more detailed and frequent observation to detect. Reconnaissance flights emphasized pattern analysis, comparing subtle changes over time rather than relying solely on prominent structures. Imagery collected revealed an increase in underground construction in mountainous and forested areas. Tunnel complexes expanded rapidly, with multiple entrances and supporting infrastructure such as power lines and ventilation systems. Spoil heaps appeared and were later concealed or redistributed, indicating deliberate efforts to mask activity. These features were catalogued meticulously, with analysts noting correlations between construction progress and transportation movements. The reconnaissance group also documented increased movement of specialized personnel and equipment. Temporary barracks appeared near certain sites, and vehicle concentrations fluctuated in ways inconsistent with routine military deployments. Rail cars associated with heavy machinery and fuel transport were observed arriving under heightened security measures. These findings were integrated into broader intelligence assessments concerning the status and readiness of experimental programs. Enemy air defense tactics continued to evolve. Radar coverage expanded inland, and mobile flak units were redeployed along likely reconnaissance corridors. Pilots encountered coordinated barrages that suggested centralized control and improved communication between detection and firing units. Reconnaissance aircraft responded by varying altitudes and exploiting weather conditions, including flying above cloud layers to reduce visual detection while relying on instrument navigation. Encounters with advanced enemy aircraft persisted, though still infrequent. Reports described sightings of twin-engine jet aircraft operating at high speed and altitude, often in pairs or small formations. These aircraft did not engage reconnaissance planes directly, but their presence was noted and reported consistently. Technical intelligence units compiled these observations alongside production estimates derived from aerial imagery of manufacturing facilities. As the war entered its final year, reconnaissance missions increasingly focused on confirming the degradation or relocation of experimental weapon capabilities. Bombing campaigns had damaged many known sites, and follow-up photography assessed repair efforts. Some locations showed signs of abandonment, with equipment removed and structures left incomplete. Others demonstrated rapid reconstruction, indicating continued priority despite resource constraints. The reconnaissance group participated in coordinated operations involving multiple units to ensure comprehensive coverage of critical regions. Overlapping photographic runs allowed analysts to cross-verify findings and reduce uncertainty. This approach proved particularly valuable when assessing underground facilities, where surface indicators alone could be ambiguous. Intelligence gained from reconnaissance flights influenced both offensive and defensive planning. Air defense units adjusted deployment based on identified launch orientations and estimated ranges. Strategic planners incorporated reconnaissance findings into assessments of enemy intent and capability, particularly concerning the potential use of experimental weapons against advancing ground forces or rear-area targets. Throughout this period, reconnaissance pilots operated under conditions of sustained fatigue and operational pressure. Sortie frequency increased, and turnaround times between missions shortened. Maintenance crews faced shortages of spare parts and materials, requiring improvisation within established technical standards. Despite these constraints, aircraft availability remained sufficient to meet intelligence requirements. As Allied ground forces advanced into areas previously surveyed only from the air, opportunities arose to compare aerial intelligence with physical evidence. Reconnaissance photographs were used to guide ground units to specific locations of interest. Subsequent inspections confirmed the accuracy of many aerial assessments, including measurements of structures and identification of functional components. Captured facilities provided tangible confirmation of experimental weapon development. Components recovered on the ground matched those inferred from aerial imagery, validating interpretation methods. Documentation found at these sites further clarified production timelines and technical challenges faced by German programs. This information was fed back into intelligence channels, refining ongoing reconnaissance priorities. The reconnaissance group continued to document the movement of materials and personnel toward the interior of Germany as Allied forces closed in. Photographs showed dismantled equipment loaded onto rail cars and convoys departing under escort. These movements were tracked over successive sorties, revealing patterns of evacuation and consolidation. Weather conditions during late autumn and winter imposed additional challenges. Reduced daylight hours and persistent cloud cover limited photographic opportunities. Reconnaissance missions exploited brief weather windows, often flying in marginal conditions to obtain essential coverage. Camera technology and film selection were adjusted to maximize usable imagery under low-light conditions. Despite the deteriorating situation faced by German forces, some experimental activities persisted until the final months of the war. Reconnaissance imagery captured evidence of continued testing and limited production, even as conventional military infrastructure collapsed. These findings underscored the determination to pursue technological solutions despite strategic setbacks. As Allied air superiority became overwhelming, enemy fighter opposition diminished, though ground defenses remained hazardous. Reconnaissance aircraft encountered sporadic but intense flak fire, particularly near remaining high-value sites. Damage rates remained significant, and emergency landings occurred with greater frequency due to mechanical wear and combat stress. The reconnaissance group's operational records from this phase reflect a consistent emphasis on factual reporting and procedural adherence. Mission logs detailed routes, altitudes, weather conditions, and observed enemy activity with standardized terminology. Photographic archives were organized chronologically and geographically, facilitating comparative analysis. By early 1945, reconnaissance missions extended to regions deep within Germany and into areas bordering other theaters of operation. Intelligence coordination with Allied services increased, as information regarding experimental weapons had implications beyond the immediate European context. Data sharing protocols were established to ensure timely dissemination to relevant commands. As the conflict approached its conclusion, reconnaissance priorities shifted toward verification of cessation of activity and identification of remaining assets. Photographs documented deserted facilities, damaged infrastructure, and the absence of personnel. These images contributed to assessments of residual threat levels and informed post-conflict planning. The reconnaissance group maintained operational readiness until hostilities ceased. Final missions focused on confirming compliance with surrender conditions and locating sites of technical interest for subsequent investigation. The transition from wartime operations to post-war assessment was gradual, with reconnaissance aircraft continuing to fly under revised directives. The body of work produced by the group during this period constituted a comprehensive visual and documentary record of enemy experimental weapon development and deployment. This record was preserved in intelligence archives and later used in technical evaluations, historical analyses, and legal proceedings. The continuity of observation from initial detection through final verification provided a unique perspective on the life cycle of wartime technological programs. The events and activities documented here illustrate the sustained role of aerial reconnaissance in shaping operational understanding during the latter stages of the war. Through systematic observation, disciplined reporting, and integration with broader intelligence efforts, the reconnaissance group contributed to a factual and verifiable account of developments that might otherwise have remained obscured. Their operations during this phase represented the continuation of established practices under increasingly complex and demanding conditions, forming an integral part of the final chapters of the air war in Europe. As the collapse of organized German resistance accelerated in the spring of 1945, aerial reconnaissance entered its final operational phase. The objectives of these missions reflected the transition from active combat intelligence to verification, documentation, and preparation for post-war assessment. Reconnaissance units, including the group described here, were tasked with confirming the status of previously identified experimental weapon sites, locating any remaining facilities not yet documented, and establishing a comprehensive record of enemy technological infrastructure before it could be destroyed, abandoned, or obscured. Flight planning during this period emphasized coverage rather than evasion. Enemy fighter activity had diminished sharply, and radar-guided flak, while still dangerous in isolated areas, no longer presented the coordinated threat encountered earlier. Reconnaissance aircraft flew more direct routes, often at lower altitudes to improve photographic resolution. This shift increased exposure to small arms fire but allowed for more detailed imagery of surface features, equipment remnants, and facility layouts. Photographs taken in early 1945 showed widespread disruption across the transportation network. Rail lines leading to former experimental sites were damaged or unused, rolling stock was abandoned on sidings, and road traffic was minimal. Many installations previously active showed clear signs of evacuation. Buildings stood intact but empty, with doors open, camouflage netting removed or left collapsed, and perimeter defenses unmanned. In other cases, deliberate demolition was evident, with structures partially destroyed and debris scattered in patterns consistent with controlled charges. Reconnaissance imagery also documented efforts to conceal evidence in the final stages of the war. Some facilities had been burned, and equipment remnants were visible only as charred outlines. In forested areas, entrances to underground complexes were sealed or obstructed with rubble. Spoil heaps were leveled or dispersed, and access roads were rendered impassable. These actions were recorded systematically, with analysts noting the sequence of destruction by comparing images taken days or weeks apart. As Allied ground forces advanced into these regions, coordination between air and ground intelligence intensified. Reconnaissance photographs were annotated and distributed to field units tasked with securing technical sites. Aerial imagery guided patrols to specific coordinates, enabling rapid location of facilities that might otherwise have remained hidden. This cooperation reduced the risk of sensitive materials being removed or destroyed before inspection. Ground confirmation of aerial intelligence began to provide definitive validation of earlier assessments. Allied technical teams reported that structures identified from the air corresponded closely in size, orientation, and function to photographic interpretations. Launch ramps, assembly halls, test stands, and control bunkers matched measurements derived from reconnaissance imagery. This correspondence reinforced confidence in aerial reconnaissance as a primary intelligence source. Captured documents and equipment recovered from these sites offered additional context. While the reconnaissance group did not directly participate in ground recovery, the information flowed back into intelligence channels that included aerial units. Technical drawings, production logs, and test records clarified the purpose of facilities photographed months earlier. These materials confirmed that the experimental weapons observed were at varying stages of development and deployment, with some systems reaching operational use despite significant technical limitations. Reconnaissance flights continued even after formal surrender negotiations began, under directives to verify compliance and identify any unauthorized activity. Aircraft flew over designated zones to ensure that launch sites remained inactive and that no further testing occurred. These missions were conducted under revised rules of engagement, reflecting the changing political and military context. Weather conditions during the final weeks remained variable, but operational urgency diminished. Reconnaissance sorties were scheduled to maximize coverage rather than frequency. Maintenance standards were maintained, though wear accumulated over years of intensive use was evident in airframes and engines. Ground crews continued routine servicing, ensuring that aircraft remained safe for flight until operations concluded. The final reconnaissance missions documented the aftermath of the experimental programs. Photographs captured empty test fields, dismantled infrastructure, and landscapes altered by years of construction and bombardment. In some locations, local civilian activity had begun to resume, with agricultural work visible near former military installations. These images marked the transition from wartime utility to historical record. As hostilities formally ended, reconnaissance units received orders to stand down from combat operations. Aircraft were reassigned, returned to depots, or prepared for redeployment to other theaters if required. The reconnaissance group completed its final flights under operational control and transitioned to administrative status. The photographic archives compiled by the group were consolidated and transferred to central intelligence repositories. Film negatives, prints, and interpretive reports were catalogued according to standardized systems. This material formed part of the evidentiary base used in post-war technical evaluations, intelligence summaries, and historical documentation. Post-war analysis drew heavily on the continuity of reconnaissance coverage established during the conflict. Analysts traced the development of experimental weapon programs from initial construction through operational use and eventual collapse. The ability to reconstruct this progression relied on consistent, methodical aerial observation over extended periods. The reconnaissance group's contribution was characterized by adherence to procedure and factual reporting. Mission logs, flight reports, and photographic interpretations were preserved without alteration. These records allowed later reviewers to assess decisions and conclusions based on contemporaneous data rather than retrospective interpretation. In the immediate post-war period, some members of the reconnaissance group participated in debriefings and technical discussions aimed at extracting lessons learned. Their experience informed the development of future reconnaissance doctrine, including aircraft design, sensor integration, and intelligence processing methods. These discussions focused on practical considerations derived from operational experience. The experimental weapons encountered during the war influenced post-war military research globally. The reconnaissance data provided one of the earliest comprehensive external records of these systems. Technical intelligence organizations use this information to guide their own development efforts and to understand the strategic implications of emerging technologies. The reconnaissance group's wartime service concluded without public recognition at the time, consistent with the classified nature of their work. Over subsequent decades, declassified materials allowed historians to reconstruct their role within the broader context of the air war. The narrative that emerged was grounded in documented observation rather than interpretation. The sustained aerial reconnaissance effort described here illustrates the integration of observation, analysis, and operational response across multiple phases of the conflict. From initial detection of anomalous activity to final verification of cessation, the reconnaissance group provided a continuous factual record of enemy experimental weapon development. This record stands as part of the larger historical documentation of the Second World War. It reflects the cumulative work of pilots, ground crews, analysts, and planners operating within established systems and procedures. The accuracy and reliability of the information collected were the result of disciplined practice under conditions of risk and uncertainty. The end of reconnaissance operations marked the conclusion of a distinct chapter in the air war. The aircraft, equipment, and personnel that had carried out these missions transitioned to peacetime roles or were demobilized. The intelligence products they generated remained, forming a durable account of events that had unfolded largely beyond public view at the time. In retrospect, the reconnaissance group's encounters with experimental enemy weapons were not isolated incidents but part of a broader pattern of technological escalation during the war. Their work provided concrete evidence of these developments and enabled informed responses. The historical value of this record lies in its contemporaneity and precision. The narrative presented here follows that record closely, reflecting the documented sequence of events as preserved in operational and intelligence archives. It is through such records that an accurate understanding of wartime developments can be maintained, ensuring that the experiences and efforts of those involved are represented with fidelity to the facts. By the conclusion of hostilities, the reconnaissance group had fulfilled its assigned role within the Allied air forces. Its contribution was embedded within the collective effort that defined the outcome of the conflict. The photographic images, reports, and analyses produced during its operations remain part of the enduring historical documentation of the Second World War.